Hello everyone, it's the storyteller here. I've prepared something slow, eerie, and sleep-friendly for you tonight. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Are you drifting off already, or still wide awake? In the morning light. The earlier days of the apocalypse was only chaos. Death and smoke gripped the air. I could feel it stale all around me. It coated my skin, my clothes, my hair. Fear pulsed through every vein. Terror gripped every muscle. Dread gnawed every brain. It was melted into the eyes of everyone you passed. When would it happen to me? When will I watch it happen to someone I love? What could we have done differently? Thoughts that would plague my mind. Over and over, my new reality. The dead no longer stayed dead, and those bitten became deranged, unreachable. They would rip out their hair, scream into the night, pick the skin off their bones until they would be covered in dark, bloody scabs that never seemed to heal. The worst was when they came for you, their eyes empty pits as they chased after you with never-ending endurance and unnatural speed. Nothing like seeing a crippled old woman hit by a truck going 40 mph, only to rise again unfazed, keeping pace with a teenager as she drags her mangled foot behind her. The only advantage left was the inability to use their brains. They couldn't climb ladders or trees. They couldn't open doors or sneak through windows. And in this world, we had to use every advantage we could get. In those early days, everyone still held on to their humanity. The memories of their old life still fresh. I remember thinking that things may eventually go back to normal. Eventually, where my biggest problem was maybe forgetting my lunch at home, or something as juvenile as what to wear to my meeting. However, everything this new world touched was tainted. Cities burned, homes abandoned, our population destroyed, leaving only a handful of us left. Fortunate would not a word I would use for the survivors. What I was fortunate for, however, was the group I had found a few months prior. They were mostly good people in present standards. We didn't rob from the living. We didn't murder the innocent or strike down the weak. We took care of one another and watched each other's back. Everyone pulled their weight, from going on supply runs, to working the garden, to gathering firewood. The group consisted of 15 of us who camped deep in a national forest near Colorado Springs. The supply runs were little more than a day's trip, and our traveling group consisted of 3 people always. I would go as often as I could, preferring to stay on the move to keep my shifting thoughts at bay. We always played it safe and quiet, successfully making it 5 months without losing a member. This should have brought me an ounce of comfort, that it has been a while since we lost someone, so it must mean we were getting wiser. although all I could think to count on was luck, and any day that luck would eventually run out and disaster would strike. We were camped out in some loft apartments bordering the forest. Paul was on watch duty, while Libby slept on the couch adjacent to mine. I remember falling asleep with blankets wrapped around me that reminded me of a moldy scent that used to cling to clothes that were left in the washer longer than they should have been. It used to bother me using strangers' belongings like their clothes or blankets, especially when the entire place still smelled of old cigar smoke. However, I came to be grateful for the comfort of being in a semi-safe, warm spot for the night. I woke with a jerk, jarring myself out of my typical reoccurring nightmare. Sweat forced my dark hair to cling to my forehead. Panting, I mindlessly reached for the weapon beside me. My hands found only a butcher knife I snagged from the kitchen before falling to sleep. Remembering I had given Paul my handgun for his rotation of watch, since it was less bulky than the shotgun he often slugged around. I tried to calm my racing heart, but something had just felt wrong. I looked over, seeing Libby's still sleeping form. I started to stand, wondering how long I had been asleep. Surely Paul was well past his shift. I reached the window, pulling back the blinds to find gray light pouring through the opening. My heart sank. Paul was supposed to wake me hours ago. I didn't see him anywhere in the still, dark living room. I silently walked over to Libby and gave her a gentle shake before stepping back, knowing she slept with a knife under her pillow. She sat up with a gasp, her blonde hair frizzing out from her worn braid. "Something is wrong. Paul should have woken me hours ago." She stared at me blankly, my words taking a few seconds longer to comprehend as she shook sleep from her mind. "Where is he?" she asked, blinking vigorously. Her green eyes roamed the shadows of the living room. I had liked Libby from the moment I met her a few months prior. She had found us on her own, days after losing her partner to a minor infection that would have only required a throughout cleaning and maybe a few antibiotic before the outbreak. I've never asked, but she couldn't be much younger than me, her youth apparent in her round cheeks. Paul, on the other hand, was well older than us Bother. He looked closer to my father's age, gray hairs dusting his hair and reaching down into his beard. It was out of character for him to wander off on his own. We survived by following strict rules that I know that he knew, because I had gone on more runs with Paul than anyone else in the group. "I'm not sure. Help me look around?" She nodded and tossed her blanket to the side, wobbling a bit as she stood. Once we were sure that he was nowhere inside, my cold panic really did begin to take hold. We quickly gathered our limited supplies. I carried Paul's shotgun and bag with mine, thankful that he had always packed light. Outside, The light from the sun began to coat everything in a golden hue. The chilled, damp air hung from everything from the night before. I moved as silently as I could, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of Paul. It was mornings like this that seemed to deceive you and hide the horrors of the world we lived in. I would have loved a day like this, before the outbreak. The birds chirping, the air smelling of fresh pine, the clouds peacefully drifting through the sky. If only a heavy sense, a dread, didn't cling around me, throat like a noose. I rounded the corner of one of the buildings, with Libby close behind. Before me stretched a courtyard. A few trees stretched tall, casting long shadows. The trees were surrounded by a few dry patches of grass and shrubs. I had to shift my head a bit to the right, but I saw him standing there, maybe 50 feet away. His name was on the tip of my tongue. It was nearly out of my mouth in a whisper before something slammed my jaw shut. The way he stood gave me pause. His neck seemed to hang from his shoulders. The way he stood, his arms dangling empty at his sides, unmoving. I began to reach out to stop Libby, but before I could, she slammed into me. The knife she gripped in her hand clanged loudly through the still air into the shotgun strapped to my back. The breath in my lungs left me like someone had just punched me in the stomach. I looked to where Paul stood, horror clogged in my throat, as his head whipped towards us. What had happened next came in a blur. Minutes passed in seconds, my body numb as my instinct took control of my muscles. I grabbed Libby's arm and began to sprint as fast as I could. We ran across a street, hearing Paul's footfalls quickly gaining on us. I refused to turn around. I didn't trust blindly running into one of dark doorways that could hold any number of threats. Instead, my eyes scanned for anything we could climb. Relief spread over me as I spotted a ladder that hung from one of the buildings. I urged Libby ahead of me, letting her climb the ladder first as I turned, planting my feet. I raised the rifle, cocking it back before aiming it at Paul's head. I fired before my fear could choke me. His nearness unsettled me. He dropped hard to the ground, unmoving and lifeless, his body skidding against the pavement, twisting unnaturally as it landed. I turned, climbing the ladder after Libby. My mind played over what I saw before the bullet ripped through Paul. In a flash, I saw blood that coated Paul's throat, but not from a bite. It looked more like a slash from a blade. I tried to focus on the placement of my hands on the rungs of the ladder, but my mind buzzed. Finally reaching the top, I froze, overlooking onto the roof, where Libby stood motionless. Before her stood a man. His hands reached out before him, as if he were trying to calm a spooked animal. Without thought, I pointed the rifle directly at him. Below me, I was faintly aware of the infected down below, gathering at the base of the ladder. Their frenzies, gargled sounds, reaching my ears. However, all my focus was on the man on the roof. His attention turned to me, and in that instance, shock radiated through me. I knew this man. I recognized his dark brown eyes from another lifetime ago, when his eyes didn't hold circles, bags, and his skin seemed to hang from his bones. He had worked in my department. For years we had walked the same halls and attended the same meetings. His name formed on my mouth, without though, as I slowly lowered the rifle. "Jesse?" His eyes widened at the sound of his name. He lowered his arms. He looked different, almost unrecognizable, as he stared back at me. Libby and I joined him on the roof. Libby silently sat, staring blankly ahead towards the slow-moving clouds. I, however, stood with Jesse, staring over towards the small town that was now crawling with infected, their screams and snarls echoing through the streets below. "Bad call, firing the rifle," Jesse said. His word came out a harsh whisper. His tone disturbed me. No person was the same after the outbreak, but something about Jesse seemed off. Hysteria seemed to have set into his once warm eyes. His jerky movements made me feel as if he was close to the edge of insanity. This man was not the one I had known in my life prior. I wanted to take Libby and leave as soon as I could, but the streets below were unsafe. I tried to calm my nerves and talk soothingly to the man, giving no indications to my fear other than the bullet already loaded into the chamber. I know I regret it now, but I just wanted to give us enough time to reach the ladder. His hand twitched at his side. "Well, look what you did." He angrily pointed at the street below. When he moved his arm, my gaze drifted to his hip, where a gun poked from waistband. I had noticed it before, however. Now I could see it now in detail. I inhaled a sharp breath as realization soaked in. I grabbed the shotgun, slowly bringing it around to my front. The motion caused his head to snap in my direction. "Where did you get that gun?" I asked, my voice coming out shaky. Anger twisted his face as he grabbed it the same second I took aim with the rifle. Libby stood swiftly at the quick change of our position. The gun he held was my gun, the one that I had given to Paul the night prior. "I found it," Jesse said, his voice coming out in a snarl. The image of Paul running towards me replayed in my mind. His throat slit. "You killed Paul," I said, bothered by how my voice quivered. Jesse shook his head hard, as if he were trying to shake a thought out of his head. His arm twitched again. Nausea rolled up my throat, terrified of this crazed man before me. His face kept twitching, and he jerked again, using his free hand to wipe the sweat from his forehead. I have seen my share of evil men in this world, but something about Jesse was different. That is when I saw it. A trickle of blood running down his forearm, poking out from his sleeve, was just the outline of a bite mark. You're infected, aren't you, Jesse? Anger contorted his face again as I said his name. He was on the edge of turning. I could see that now. His twitch movement, his sunken eyes, his pale, sweat-soaked skin. All signs that a person was infected. I placed my hand on the trigger, ready to pull it, well aware that if I fired the then, he would too. We would most likely both go down, and Libby would be alone. However, at least she would be alive. Don't do this. Please. My voice came out hoarse, pleading. Just then, something shifted in his eye. Clarity. For just a brief moment, the old, kind Jesse I knew was there. I'm sorry. He looked scared. Then he pulled the gun back, aiming it at his own head, and fired. The force knocked him sideways, and I watched as his body tumbled over the side of the roof. Libby let out a shriek as I stood in silent horror, my hand clamped over my mouth. I ran to the edge, peering over at his disfigured body as it lay 3 stories down. It took only seconds for the horde to surround him and began ripping into his flesh. I stepped back, nearly tripping on thin air. I seen some dark things. I was no stranger to tragedy. However, it was something I could never get used to. The sound of his croaking apology replayed in my mind. Sorry for what? For killing Paul? For not making his bite known sooner? I wondered if he had even known what he had even done to Paul. I know the infection took hold before the person was completely lost, stealing bit by bit until there was nothing left. I knew I would see Jesse again. He would eventually join me in my nightmares, like all the others. Him and Paul would haunt me until I met my own fate one day. Aunt Cass, if I felt anything for the man sitting across from me at the dinner table, it would have been an incredibly romantic evening. The restaurant was dimly lit. We'd each had 2 glasses of red wine. There was a string quartet playing a lovely tune at the center of the dining room. And Samuel looked handsome that night. Well, for him. His suit was a size too big, and he had gotten a weird haircut that week. But he'd never looked better. Champagne? He asked me. Dear God, I thought to myself. He did not put the ring in a champagne glass. 3 minutes later, our waiter set a champagne glass down in front of me with a sparkling diamond ring at the bottom of the glass. I squealed and smiled at Samuel. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. I kissed him, because that's what you do when you accept a marriage proposal. I slipped the ring on my finger. I did not want to, and would not marry this man. But my squeal of enthusiasm was real. I was thrilled to be his fiancée at last. Check. A year ago, I received a different marriage proposal from a man who is Samuel's opposite in every way. Theodore is handsome, clever, ambitious, and can fill out a suit. We met at the magazine where I'd been working as an associate editor for 5 years. He started with us as a weekly humor columnist, and we began dating almost immediately. I was hesitant at first. I had avoided romantic entanglements ever since an incident during my junior year of college. Eventually, Theodore's small gestures won me over, saving the Times crossword for me and laying it on my desk every morning, surprising me with coffee from my favorite place in the village. Once I agreed to a first date, dinner at Bistro. I fell hard and fast. I had never been in love like that before. I couldn't wait to open my eyes and see him beside me every morning. And there was no moment of my life, exhilarating or devastating, that I didn't want to share with him. I did try to stop. I tried to keep things casual, suggesting that best friends with benefits could be an option for us. Theodore just laughed at me, his blue eyes sparkling. It was impossible. We were clearly meant to be more than friends. The inevitable was drawing closer and closer. When Theodore suggested dinner at Bistro on the 2nd anniversary of our first date, I started to panic. Aunt Cass's voice echoing in the back of my head. I tried everything I could to cancel our anniversary dinner. I blamed a family commitment, but it turned out that Theodore had gone to my parents to ask for their blessing, so that plan failed. I told Theodore I had a deadline at work, but the editorial staff was in the loop and had cleared my schedule for the weekend. The night of the Bistro dinner, we left straight from the office. Theodore went downstairs ahead of me to get a cab, and I looked frantically around my office for a reason to stay. "Do I have any messages?" I asked my assistant. Samuel shook his head, giving me a dopey grin. "None." Check. The thing you need to understand is that I desperately wanted to marry Theodore. Everything about our relationship was amazing. The sex, the conversations, the unconditional emotional support. Everything. An engagement, however, was out of the question. When we got to Bistro, Theodore had reserved a quiet table in the corner. I observed all the small details, the music, the lighting, the flowers, and I suddenly felt dizzy, like I needed to sit down. Theodore pulled out the chair for me to sit. Yet another sweet and small romantic gesture that made me love him even more. "I can't marry you," I exclaimed. I'd never seen a person's face crumple like that. He was 31 years old, and he looked like a distraught toddler. Theodore let go of the back of my chair and started to back away from the table silently. "No," I said, seizing his hand. "You have to let me explain why." That's when I told him about Aunt Cass. "It's really hard to explain, Aunt Cass. Our family was Italian, passionate, loud, and full of characters. An aunt who made racist comments after 3 glasses of wine. The cousin who would always end up passed out around a table. And Aunt Cass, who everyone said could predict the future. It supposedly started when she was a kid. Her mom asked her about having a play date with a friend, and 5-year-old Cass said she couldn't go because of Uncle Joey's funeral. Uncle Joey, healthy as a horse, collapsed and died of an aneurysm 2 days later. After that, her predictions were a regular occurrence. Sometimes, Aunt Cass delivered warnings, attempting to help family members avoid a negative consequence, like when she warned my oldest cousin, Mia, not to go to a school dance, or she'd risk a grave injury. Mia stayed home. The limo her friends rented was in a horrible accident, and 3 kids ended up in the hospital. Other times, Cass's predictions were more definitive, unavoidable, like when she told her cousin Freddie that he was about to be fired. He was furious, stormed away from the Sunday dinner table, called her a liar. Yet when his boss called him into her office 2 days later to give him the bad news, no one in our family, not even Freddie, was surprised. It was accepted family lore that Cass's predictions were accurate. For that reason, I did my best to avoid her. Occasionally, her predictions were positive, like when she told my sister Tori that she'd get into Juilliard. But for the most part, they were gloomy and eerie, words that would haunt you every moment until the prophecy was fulfilled. Aunt Cass tended to make her predictions in private conversations during our weekly Sunday dinners at Nonna's house, so I stuck with my sisters during those evenings. I did my best to never be on my own and in Cass's eye line. Then one night, during my junior year of college, we were watching TV in Nonna's den, and my little sister stole my dessert. Just snatched up my chocolate chip cannoli with a wicked grin on her face. I whacked her in the arm and retreated to the kitchen to get a new one. It happened so fast. There Aunt Cass was, smiling at me as she brewed the coffee. And all of a sudden, she was speaking. "You'll have 3 men in your life," she said casually. I froze, one hand about to select a new dessert. Was this how it happened? Aunt Cass had cornered my sister Isabella last month to tell her that she'd never be a movie star, but Isabella hadn't mentioned such an informal tone. The first one will break your heart. The second man will become your fiancé, but will die before you can marry. The third will be your happily ever after, Aunt Cass continued. She handed me a napkin and a paper plate for my cannoli. Aunt Cass, I wasn't typically speechless. I had goosebumps on my arms and legs. She left the room, and I heard her start talking to my Nonna about a doctor's appointment she was taking her to the next day. Aunt Cass had delivered her prediction. and now she was ready to return to small talk. I didn't tell anyone. I had a boyfriend at the time. We'd been dating for 3 years, and we talked about marriage and kids. 6 months after Aunt Cass's prediction, I caught him cheating with my best friend. It was upsetting, but I wasn't surprised. Jag. This was the story I told Theodore that night at Bistro. The look he gave me afterward was scornful. Gia, you can't possibly believe that nonsense, he said. I was crushed. Theodore had never looked at me like that before, with something close to contempt. He didn't know what it felt like to be in my family and watch impossible things occur and know that disbelief did nothing. I can't. I just love you too much to risk it, I exclaimed. My eyes filled with tears. I did love him. I loved Theodore with a strength of feeling I'd never experienced before. The second man will become your fiancé, but will die before you can marry. If he died, I would want to die as well. The thought of losing him was too much to bear. He stood there, absorbing the information, and I could see a shift in his expression. I was becoming a different person in his eyes. A kook, a nut job, someone not serious or stable enough to love and marry. It was infuriating that Aunt Cass had done this to me. I was 29 years old, and her prophecy had been haunting me for a decade. I avoided intimacy. I resigned myself to a lonely life. I was scared of never finding someone to love, and equally afraid that when I did, they would die, and it would somehow be my fault. Enough. A small voice inside my head pushed Aunt Cass out, and I felt calm and resolute for the first time in weeks. It's really nothing, I said, striving to make my voice sound conversational. It's just a hard thing to shake, and I've been... I paused, sensing it would give my next words more impact. I've been lied to my entire life. It was as if a light that had flickered out reignited in Theodore's eyes. He looked at me hopefully. Give me a little time, I said to him. I just need to work it all out. Someday, maybe, I'd be able to give him a different answer. Our co-workers were shocked when I started dating my assistant, Samuel, a week later. He had always had a crush on me. He was young, impressionable, sweet, dopey. It was refreshing to be with him. Everything with Theodore had been so intense, and my relationship with Samuel was easy. We had to transfer him, of course, for HR purposes, and he ended up as the assistant to the editor in the office next door to Theodore. It was challenging, watching Theodore from afar for all those months. I watched him, watching me and Samuel, and I wished I could whisper what I was really thinking into his ear. It was simple to encourage a quick engagement and wedding. From the beginning, I told Samuel that I wanted to wait until after marriage for us to have sex, and he obliged. I blamed my Italian Catholic upbringing, and he was supportive. The abstinence was part of my plan to keep us moving forward. Nothing encourages a man to speed up a wedding date like a vow of chastity. Jack, after I accepted Samuel's proposal, after we told our families and started making plans for a wedding, after we set a date that was just 6 months away, I waited. It was agony. Theodore started to date. I couldn't invest in wedding planning with any enthusiasm when I knew the event wouldn't actually occur. My mother adored Samuel, who was happy to help with choices and errands, and they planned happily together while I pretended to be busy at work. I was at the office late one night when Theodore caught me by the hand as I was leaving. "What are you doing?" he asked me. "I thought you just needed time." I walked away. He would understand soon enough. Jack, 3 weeks before the wedding, I started to panic. Cha-cha. 3 days before the wedding, Samuel took me to dinner at the restaurant where he'd proposed. It was the last time we'd see each other alone before the wedding. He had a bachelor party the next evening, and I had a bachelorette, and then we'd have the rehearsal dinner. It was so sweet that he'd thought, just as Theodore had, to bring me back to a restaurant where we'd had a beautiful memory. It seemed I was destined to have boyfriends who excelled at romance. I didn't feel romanced. I was terrified. I was waking up screaming at night, and I felt tremors in my hands and feet periodically throughout the day. I couldn't eat. I knew what true love was. I'd had it with Theodore. A marriage with Samuel would be devastating for me after the years I'd spent as Theodore's lover. And if the wedding actually happened, well, my parents would throw a wild fit if I even mentioned the word divorce to them. I needed to end it. We took a walk through the park after dinner, and then we went up to the roof deck at the top of my apartment building. It was a cool evening. I walked over to the edge of the roof to stand at the railing. The building was 20 stories tall. I felt Samuel wrap his arms around me, rubbing my bare arms to keep me warm. "Do you want my jacket?" he asked. "No," I said. Then I seized his arm and swung him forward. I watched him fall 20 stories to the street. Chatara. It occurred to me during the memorial service that everyone in attendance would have been at our wedding. The death was ruled an accident by the authorities. No one had seen Samuel fall. After years of feeling like I lived beneath an unlucky star, things were working out in my favor. Aunt Cass hugged me tightly at the funeral. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," she said, crying and whispering so that only I could hear. "I hate when I'm right about these things." I hugged her back and wished that I could thank her for saving me from a worser fate. There was no way to know if I could trust her, though. The plan wasn't always supposed to be this. For weeks, I'd waited for some accidental calamity to befall Samuel. I would have grieved it. He was only 28 years old. But I wouldn't have had to resort to what I did. It simply wasn't fair, the way Aunt Cass's predictions ruined lives, ended lives. Jack, after everything was over, the funeral, the the memorial service. I called Theodore and asked him to dinner. His voice sounded perplexed. "I've been thinking about you," he said. "I'm so sorry about what happened." It had been about a year since I'd rejected his proposal. "It was terrible," I said quietly. He was so young. Theodore was silent for a few moments. I wished that he was in the room with me, that I could look at his face and guess what he was thinking. "And you're calling to ask me to dinner?" he asked slowly. "Things are different now," I said. "Bistro, 7 p.m. There was another beat of silence. "I'll pick you up at 6:30 p.m., he said. We hung up, and I frowned. He didn't sound excited. But then, I'd broken his heart a year ago, and it might take time for things to mend. Trebcho. When I opened the door at 6:30 p.m., 2 uniformed police officers were waiting to patiently explain to me about the footage that had been found on a neighbor's security camera and the motive that had been revealed to them by the love of my life. I used my phone call to reach Theodore. "How could you do this?" I asked him. I didn't even recognize my own voice. It was high-pitched, wild, and frantic. "Who's going to be my happily ever after?" "I don't know," he said coldly. "Maybe the lady in the cell next door." He slammed down the phone. That was ludicrous, I thought to myself. Aunt Cass's prediction had clearly stated that there would be 3 men in my life. I held the phone to my ear, briefly after he hung up. I needed a moment to breathe. All I could think about was Aunt Cass, with her words that had haunted me for the past 10 years. The woman was insane. She ruined lives. "Nature's the bomb." Landon's phone pinged again, disturbing the peaceful mountain hiking path. Woodrow Alfredson's right eye twitched from the tension building up in his body. It grew like static electricity in the air. "Will you turn that damned thing off? This is a relaxing father-son hike. It's hard to enjoy the beauty of nature with your mobile beeping like a bomb. Shh, this is important. Tensions are escalating in..." He acted without thinking. He'd been absent for most of Landon's upbringing, gone in the mornings and evenings. He was missing most weekends, and even when he was present, he was tense and exhausted. But what kind of a father would he be if he allowed his teenage kid to silence him with a shh? It was never too late to start acting like a dad. Woodrow grabbed his son's phone, hateful device, and hurled it down the mountainside. The black rectangle clattered and crashed and banged along the rocks. Its screen shattered. Bits of computer chips and internal wiring flew away as it spiraled to its death. "Dad, what? Enough!" Landon recoiled, eyes wide. He stepped backwards and tripped over a stone. He landed on his backside with a winded grunt. Woodrow inhaled through his clenched teeth. He wanted what was best for his son, and that involved working long hours to ensure that Landon never wanted for anything. But now, with the military contract signed, and sealed, money was no longer a problem. Woodrow could now spend some quality time with his boy. The problem was that he'd left it a bit late, and Landon no longer cared whether his dad did anything with him. So Woodrow needed to find a way to crack through Landon's "I don't give a damn" veneer. No more. This is you and me time. I know I haven't been around much, son, but you should know I only ever did it all for you. I worked such long, long hours to give you everything you needed, to bring us to this point where we can enjoy this moment, right here, right now, on top of the world, looking down upon the beauty of nature. We never have to worry about anything ever again. I'm finished with work, forever. So now let's enjoy it, okay? I've waited so long for this time, so let's finally enjoy it. Landon's shoulders drooped. The tension bled from his body. He nodded and raised his hands. He'd scraped some of the skin off his palms when he'd fallen, and tiny droplets of blood beaded there. Yeah, okay, Dad, okay. Woodrow offered his boy his hand and dusted him off once he was back upright. Good lad. I'll buy you a new one when we get back down. God knows we can afford it now. Hell, I can buy you 10 of them. Now come on, we're almost at the summit. Not much further now. The trees thinned the higher up they got. The going became more arduous, and the air became cleaner. The path took a turn and led them out to a plateau overlooking the lands. The mountain dropped away, affording them a stunning vista of their local geography. The nearby city, their home, sparkled like a teardrop. Woodrow was panting and sweating, his heart thudding like an out-of-control jackhammer. But Landon seemed none the worse for their little trek. The wonders of youth. He stood there with his hands on his hips, sweat around his pits, and gestured at the gorgeous views. He tried to speak, but both exhaustion and wonder stunned him into silence. Dad, Landon shook his head, unable to finish his words. Wow, nature is... He groped for the correct phrase. Nature's the bomb, Woodrow grinned. But that grin didn't have the chance to last long. An air raid siren looped through the air, slicing it in half. Birds erupted from the trees in a flock that blotted out the sun. The sinusoidal screech of doom rose and fell, rose and fell, rose and fell. It reverberated in their brains, their bowels, their bones. His smile faded, and he grunted like a caveman. A flash, brighter than 1,000 suns, lit up the sky. A faltering heartbeat later, the thud came. It rumbled deep into their hearts. A gunshot to the head of humanity. Woodrow gasped and raised his hands to protect his eyes. He staggered backwards and crashed into his son, who was doing the same. Landon reached out and grabbed for his father, scrunching up his shirt in a fist. His pale face no longer revealed the man he was becoming. Instead, he'd regressed into the small boy he'd once been. "Daddy, what is that?" Woodrow could not speak. His tongue felt heavy and lifeless in his mouth. Shards of ice poured into his veins, and the hairs on his neck prickled. He had the vertiginous sense of falling with no end. All he could get out was, "Oh my God. Oh my God." The mushroom cloud rose on the nearby horizon. His stomach rolled over, drenched in acid. No wonder the military had rushed to sign the deal. They hadn't even lasted 12 hours after he jotted his John Hancock on the agreement. Woodrow lifted his thumb, and his insides shriveled when the cloud dwarfed it. The city beneath the mushroom cloud had vanished into rubble. An expanding ripple tore across the landscape from the point of detonation. Trees and buildings fell backwards as though they were props made of cardboard. The green earth exploded into radioactive dust. The landscape flattened. The blast sanded every feature and landmark away like an angle grinder. The soil rolled in a wave as though liquefied. Woodrow had wasted his son's childhood, working towards a comfortable future. But all that hard work had branched them off into a timeline where it came back to bite him on the behind. There was money in weapons manufacturing and war profiteering, and such investments would indeed pay off. But not, it seemed, in the direction one would hope. Well, there was no future now. Woodrow had not missed the irony. He threw up his hands. "Ah, for God's sake." The shockwave hit them, and all became a blinding white light, followed by darkness. The fulfillment, swaths of red and blue, intermittently flooded my vision. Beneath the flimsy plastic, my limbs still pulsed with adrenaline. Initially, the barrage of sirens and shouts was an audible assault, but now my thundering heart drowned most of it out. An officer loomed over me, his mouth forming words that failed to reach my ears. The paramedics seemed to retort, much to his chagrin. I cast my gaze upon the modern structure ahead, an incandescent glow piercing the night. Panels of glass stared back like watchful eyes, knowing the truth of what lay within. The smooth chime of a bell reverberated through the room, joined by the squeak of feet on yoga mats. My eyelids fluttered open, just in time to see the instructor place a hand gently over her heart and give a slight bow. A lithe figure next to me uncurled like a cat, stretching to life, feline and graceful in her movements. Her name-brand attire hugged her toned curves, the same curves that I'd seen in an Instagram post this morning. Retreat Day 1. Learning to love my body. The caption was a paragraph thinly veiled as self-love and content, but the undertones bled through. Despite, rather, instead. I learned I don't need it was smoke and mirrors, the edited photos, smiling to promote green juices, the constant upgrade of wardrobes and skincare products and makeup. Behind the facade was a girl grasping at the straws of relevancy and follower counts. And judging by the way she cut her eyes at the woman in the front row of the studio now, the straws were becoming further out of reach. Allison Divino. I recalled her name then, as she continued to glare at the woman. Long auburn locks whipped in my direction as Allison spun on her heel to leave. The woman under the fire of Allison's burning gaze appeared none the wiser. She smiled as she departed, holding an air of confidence that only a ruthless businesswoman could. Genevieve Sterling, financial investment heiress and CEO. It's no wonder Allison was green with envy. After all, I imagined the salary of an influencer paled in comparison. And how nice would it be to start life with a silver spoon? I made another mental note, trying to piece together the puzzle of faces I'd encountered last night at the welcome dinner, albeit a somewhat difficult task at a silent retreat. As I made my way to the doorway, a burly shoulder jostled against my own. Glancing to the side, I was met with the red-faced glare of Victor Russo, the lawyer who constantly seemed on the verge of a tantrum. For him, this event seemed more like mandatory anger management than a relaxing weekend of introspection. Victor grumbled something, shoving his way past me and out of the boiling studio. Hot yoga was never something I'd been eager to try, and the sweat pricking my skin reminded me of that. I yearned for a shower. I padded my way down the hall to my assigned room. Stretches of glass greeted me, late afternoon sunshine glistening upon the elaborate furnishings. As I turned on the shower, steam curling into the air and coating the mirror, I observed my reflection. Brunette hair, stringy with sweat, obsidian eyes gazing back, muscles aching. I peeled off my tank top. In doing so, a prickling sensation tingled beneath the skin of one of my shoulder blades. I strained my neck to inspect it in the mirror. A patch of redness had started to form, itching with each movement, skin flexing. Running a few fingers over the spot, I hissed, the sting palpable. Perhaps it was from one of the yoga positions, rubbing against the mat as I tried, unsuccessfully, to keep up. Stepping into the steam, I relished the warm caress. Since dinner wasn't for another hour, I took my time washing, scrubbing, and generally enjoying the sound of silence. I could tell most of the others were already struggling to cope with the drastic dissolution of most noise. All of them extroverts in their daily lives. This was a challenge for them. My thoughts wandered as I went about primping myself for dinner. After curling my hair, applying makeup, strapping on my heels, and sliding a pendant around my neck, I shimmied into my dress. A vibrant red. The satin of it clung in all the right places. A flat note that gradually increased in volume hummed from the digital panel by the door. Dinner time. The savory aroma of roasting meat wafted through the dining hall. My mouth watered. The chefs here were world class. The welcome dinner the night prior exemplified that as I had torn into a leg of lamb and wolfed down perfectly steamed asparagus, so I knew tonight would be no different. Our selected meals were hand-delivered to each of us, half the group abstaining from meat. As I sliced into the steak before me, crimson juices pooling, my skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, I glanced up, a pair of blue eyes catching mine. His chiseled features were intense, and he didn't avert his gaze as he took a bite of his meal. The twitch of a slight smile pulled at the corners of his mouth as he continued to stare. Jackson Rothmeyer, corporate real estate mogul. I'd seen his icy gaze before, plastered across the media. He even had his own Wikipedia page. Quite the accomplishment for someone in real estate. But the way his eyes traveled ever lower made my skin crawl. He was married, after all, his wife having attended many of his philanthropic appearances. The stare down seemed to last forever, finally interrupted by the crash of glass. Everyone turned. In the far corner of the room, a bulbous man in a designer suit waved a waiter away as he attempted to collect the shattered remnants of a whiskey glass. He adjusted his tie with fumbling fingers, and if this hadn't been a silent retreat, he probably would have slurred his words. Howard Gunnison, former politician and drunkard, the man was notoriously scummy. So when I saw his face last night, I almost laughed out loud at the notion of such a human trying to better themselves. And, quite obviously, the mission was not going well. He had to have snuck a flask in to get that tanked between yoga and dinner. At the table across from Howard, a posh woman in a pantsuit curled her lip in disgust at the scene. Melissa Ellsworth, entrepreneur and public speaker. Melissa had graced many stages in her career, discussing the ins and outs of successful entrepreneurship. The details of her rags to riches story pulled on the heartstrings of the nation, inspiring the laymen to believe that perhaps they too could start their own clothing brand from the ground up. Forks scraping plates pierced the quiet, with the occasional mumble from Howard as he beckoned for a new glass of whiskey. Melissa rolled her eyes over her wine glass as she took a prolonged sip. Our fearless leader and head of the retreat entered the room then. Michael Solomon, his long hair, was tied back into a ponytail, linen clothing hanging from his thin frame. Head held high, he appraised the value of his guests, and judging from the slight sneer, I gathered that value was rather low. Conceit dwelled within him. I could sense it from a mile away. Without a word, Michael raised his hands in a gesture of thanks. The guests nodded in silence as he departed. We had seen very little of Michael since our arrival, and truthfully, he was a bit of a recluse. Perhaps that's why he enjoyed running a silent retreat. I tossed my napkin on my plate, excusing myself from dinner. With a bit of disdain, I passed by Howard, feeling his eyes on me as I brushed a bit too close to his table. I couldn't stand another second of being ogled or watching a rich drunkard make an utter fool of himself. Just after slipping off my heels, a light knock rapped against the door. Without the advantage of a peephole, I was forced to open it without screening my visitor. Jackson leaned in the doorway, hair slightly tousled. "I know we're not supposed to talk," he whispered, "but I saw the way you were looking at me at dinner." I cocked an eyebrow inquisitively, mostly at his audacity. "Don't play coy," he continued. "I know what you want, and I understand." He understands because I want it too. His hands were suddenly on me, groping, his breath hot on my neck. My skin screamed in disgust beneath his touch, and pain ignited as his hand brushed over the spot on my shoulder blade. I hissed, which he interpreted as a green light, pushing himself on me further. "I knew you wanted..." The words breathlessly tumbling from his lips were cut short, and he glanced down, wincing. A shining blade protruded from his chest. A stain, like spilled wine, spreading across the virgin white of his shirt. Blood replaced words, and he sputtered in his collapse. I took a step back, watching him crumple against the wood, smearing its polished surface. He shuddered briefly before stilling. Jackson Rothmeyer, adulterer, was no more. This wasn't his first offense, either. He was a serial offender when it came to infidelity. "Oh my God!" A horrified voice came from the hall. Allison, frozen in place, trembled. The front of my dress was stained, blood plastered across my arms. Undoubtedly, a horrifying sight. I watched as she fumbled to find her phone. The phone that I had earlier swiped from her table on my way out of dinner while she was busy glaring at Genevieve. If anyone was a liability to call for police, it was the influencer practically glued to her phone, and I needed more time. "Please," she begged, stumbling back. I had originally planned this differently, but she just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. My muscles screamed as I lunged for her. She squealed like a frantic pig. Scarlet footprints trailed me as I chased Allison into the dining hall. Again, she screamed, this time as she noticed Howard slumped over his unfinished plate, eyes blank and glassy. That one had been rather easy. A quick drop of a pill into his whiskey on my way out of the dining hall, and a long enough onset for the crowd to clear out before he succumbed. A silent tick off the checklist. There was no need for Allison to cry over Howard. Not only was he a scumbag, but his drunkenness had taken the life of another. A few years prior, blitzed from a night at the bar, Howard had struck and killed a teenage girl who had snuck out of her house. Thanks to Howard's power and some unfortunately good connections, he faced the lowest possible sentence. Allison's wailing brought me back to the moment. She cowered in a corner, eyes darting wildly in search of an escape. Though she was the lowest offender on my list, I still couldn't let her go. It was a formality. I plucked a knife from a nearby table and flung it forward with a dizzying speed. The crying stopped, and Allison slumped against the wall, the handle of the blade jutting from her eye socket. Footsteps echoed from down the hall, and I turned just in time to see Victor gawking and tripping into the room before wheeling backward. What the? His face blanched, a stark contrast to the usual beet red. He clutched his chest and staggered back. "Help!" he croaked. This one would finish itself, I supposed. Victor collapsed. I stepped carefully over to him. For a few moments, he clawed at my claves, pulled at the hem of my dress, sputtered, then silence. No longer would Victor's temper detonate at the expense of others, namely his battered wife. No longer would the law protect him from the wreckage of his short fuse. I paused for a moment, surveying the mess. Things had been set in motion now, and there was no going back. An hour later, I found myself sitting alone in the foyer. Luckily, I had managed to avoid any more blood. In one room, Melissa hung from the ceiling fan by a twisted, overpriced dress one of her company's very own. But I was certain the children who fabricated it in her sweatshops, one of whom perished due to poor labor conditions, wouldn't be too sad. Melissa had never lifted a finger to go the extra mile in life, and now she didn't even lift a finger in her own death. In another room, Genevieve lay still, adjacent to a gun that had likely cooled off by now. She snuck it in for protection, a paranoia developing since her defrauding tendencies were exposed to the public tendencies that cost so many others their livelihoods, while she raked in the profits. It was ironic. Her career had been upheaved by a smoking gun, and now she was leaving this world by a smoking gun. I tallied 6 bloody fingers, sitting cross-legged under a lone chandelier. Only one more to complete the requirements. I caught him earlier, cowering in a storage closet with a cell phone, but knew I had to save him for last. With the retreat being so isolated, I knew I had some time to wrap things up. I gathered my remaining strength, peeling myself from the floor. "Michael!" I called lackadaisically. My voice ricocheted in the barren foyer. I never did grasp the appeal of the minimalist aesthetic, the coldness and emptiness of it. Like a fox in winter, I stalked through the white-walled expanse, listening intently for my prey. A muffled sob came from the storage closet. The idiot hadn't even bothered to move. I knocked politely, opening the door to reveal the coward huddled in the far corner. "Stay back," he shouted, wielding a mop handle in defense. "I'm warning you." Michael, you just don't get it, do you?" My tone was condescending. There was some enjoyment in watching this pompous man wither. "You made a deal, and this is part of the deal. What the hell are you talking about?" I clucked my tongue, chuckled. "Hell? That's funny. You see, Michael, I know for as spiritual as you are, you can't make the world butterflies and rainbows through manifestation alone. No amount of writing out your dreams in a vegan leather journal will make them come true." "How did you know about my journal?" he asked, eyes narrowed. "Michael, I know everything. Everything about everyone. Truths you couldn't fathom. You called on a higher, or perhaps I should say, lower power for help. And here I am to seal the deal. Consider me a bounty hunter of sorts." I scratched my itching back as I tried to dumb it down for him. "Michael Solomon, you made a deal with the devil to get your dream life at any expense necessary. So that means murdering my guests and livelihood?" he cried. "In this case, yes. It's no simple feat to take that much energy from the universe to spend on one selfish person. Souls are required. Souls of 7 people, 7 deadly sins." "I don't understand," I sighed, exasperated, and proceeded to check off the requirements. Jackson Lust, Allison Envy, Howard Gluttony, Victor Wrath, Melissa Sloth, Genevieve Greed. I counted, putting a finger down with each name until only one remained. That leaves Pride. I could tell he still wasn't following. "I know how high you hold yourself, Michael, looking down your nose at others. And the fact that you were willing to sacrifice anything for your benefit says it all." The gears clicked into place in Michael's mind, and he started to sob. "Please, I'll do anything. We've already gone that route, Michael. Besides, you had your dream life, a successful business in solitude, where you could control the lives of others exactly how you wanted. It just happened to have an expiration date." I snatched the mop, snapping it in half over my knee. The unevenness of splintered wood made as good a weapon as any at the moment. Michael trembled, closed his eyes. "Don't worry, it's all about to be over." With one swift jab, I checked off the final requirement. I tossed the other half of the mop handle aside with a clatter. The sting in my shoulder blades blossomed into a full-blown ache, and I rolled them to quell the pain. Not long now, slowly, I wound my way back to the foyer, sucking in breath after breath, quicker and quicker, until I was practically hyperventilating. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer before screaming into the drive. I held my breath and willed the tears to come until they streaked down my ruddy cheeks. "Police! Come out with your hands up!" I obeyed, whimpering in my exit. "Please, help me!" I screeched. "He tried to kill me. I had to do it. He killed them all." I collapsed to my knees in the moonlight, feeling a heat begin to burn as the gravel bit into them. Once they cleared me, the paramedics quickly became preoccupied with searching for signs of life inside the blood-soaked retreat. The cops questioned me, but I feigned catatonia. It didn't matter anyway. I could feel the pull towards home, my skin smoldering beneath the emergency blanket. For a brief moment, no one watched me. I shrugged off the blanket, once again rolling my shoulders. The ache crescendoed, skin tightening. I winced, and one by one, feathers burst forth in two black plumages, wings of the fallen. The mission was complete, and the heat emanating from the earth beckoned me. "It's time," a familiar voice hissed. The heat intensified, another 7 souls feeding the flames. Newton's cradle. Something was wrong. Fatally wrong. He couldn't grasp the reason for his anxiousness. As Clive stepped onto the platform at precisely 06:05 and 35 seconds, waiting for his early morning commuter train, something was wrong, he thought. Something was not right. In those moments in his life, his mind concentrated on an image of Newton's cradle. It was idle, motionless. The big brass orbs dangling from the brass cradle. All were stationary, passive and still. But there was a sense of anticipation. The orbs were oscillating in anticipation of movement. One of the outside orbs to the left or right would start the motion, and then the orb would send all the others into a monotonous, endless click, clacking. When will one of them initiate the law of the conservation of energy, the transfer of energy, the two-way domino effect? Clive knew. He grinned with the image of Newton's cradle in the front of his mind. He could count time, the seconds, by the rhythmic striking of each brass orb in Newton's cradle. The kiss of the cold metal against cold metal. Click, clack, energy converted into time. That's what made Clive special. Clive knew how to slow down time, to make it stop. "Don't you mess up now. Stay cool, stay calm," said the voice in his head. It was his imaginary friend, he had been told. Clive knew different. Mr. Black stepped onto the platform at 06:06 and 10 seconds. In his commuter uniform, his pressed suit was covered with an elegant cashmere and wool full-length overcoat and camel-colored scarf elegantly arranged on both sides of the coat, covering the lapels. His umbrella hung on his angled arm, held in position like a soldier on parade. "Morning, Clive," greeted Mr. Black. "Not so cold this morning." Then the hushed whisper as he passed by Clive to take up his normal position on the platform. "What time will she come?" "Don't say anything." "Nothing, you idiot," the voice said gruffly in his head. Mr. Gray bundled onto the platform at 06:07 and 5 seconds, as ever fumbling nervously with his numerous pockets, more than likely trying to check on the whereabouts of his wallet, keys, making sure he hadn't forgotten anything. For the day's commute, he opened and checked his slim briefcase to locate his phone and book for the umpteenth time. "Morning, Clive," Mr. Gray said to Clive. "Bit chilly today?" Then the whisper from behind his raised hand, hiding his mouth, his lips. "What time will she come? You say a word, your life won't be worth living." The voice inside his head hissed. Mr. Brown arrived slightly late at 06:08 and 30 seconds. He continued to peer in concern at his watch, but brightened as he recognized Clive. "Morning, Clive," Mr. Brown said to Clive. "Fine morning." Then the whisper and furtive look for a fraction of a second before he said, "What time will she come?" The voice in his head made a cough, sounding like a grunt. It was a warning signal, not to reply. Mrs. Mauve and Mrs. Green stepped onto the platform together in deep conversation, talking behind animated hands. As they passed Clive, they both whispered, without turning their heads. "What time will she come?" they said in unison, and then walked to their waiting positions on the platform. "Don't!" warned the voice in Clive's head. Finally, Miss Pink arrived at 6:09 and 20 seconds. She strode confidently onto the platform like a catwalk model. She knew everybody on the platform had waited for her entrance this morning. For all the waiting passengers, it was the thrill of the day, she imagined. She walked with the same purpose as a model, a gladiator of hearts and minds. She imagined she was walking a straight line, walking directly, purposely towards Clive. And on cue, her timing was stage perfect. She winked flirtingly at Clive, the wink that meant, "Any time. I'm your license to promiscuity, buddy." A longing stare to the recipient of her wantonness. An unsaid message. "Take me." "Shut the up! You dare! You just dare!" said the angry, slightly nervous voice in his head as Miss Pink passed Clive. She whispered like everybody else, "What time will she come?" He followed her path, looking enviously at her long, shapely legs, her tight backside. Everybody was in their normal position. They all started looking downline for sight of the commuter train to the right. The tunnel entrance to the left was a dark, black hole, like a large muzzle of a gun. A void, an impenetrable blackness. It was different to the darkness of the early winter morning, where the light pollution and illuminated glare diffused the blackness and played tricks with eyes. Then the stranger arrived. He wore dark glasses and a long black trench coat styled raincoat. He looked around the platform and recognized Clive. He bowed his head and strode up to Clive. There was intent in his voice when he said, "Mr. Caldwell, I need a few words with you. Do you mind if we talk?" "Don't tell him anything. Understand? Not a word," screamed the voice. "It's an important matter, Mr. Caldwell. It's about your wife." The stranger in the long trench coat didn't finish the sentence. "Be careful now," said the voice with a menacing tone. Instantly, the golden orbs started to move in Newton's cradle. Click, clack, click, clack. The energy and counter-energy started to dance. Both the cradle and balls were shuddering, jerking in an erratic, crazed movement. "What time will she come?" said the stranger. He didn't whisper it like the others, but as the voiced question appeared in the hushed morning air, the stranger smiled a knowing smile. Clive thought he noticed a smirk. "Keep that mouth shut. Keep it shut." The voice in Clive's head was getting more than angry. It was becoming uncontrollable, insane. Click, clack, click, clack. The golden orbs had really started to move now. They were moving back and forth with the velocity of a funfair ride. Clive had forgotten the name of the ride. His brow started to sweat. His palms started to feel clammy. He felt nauseous. Bang! The explosion came from the black tunnel entrance. The impact, the latent energy of the explosion, was made more catastrophic as it was ignited from inside the tunnel. And then the trapped energy blasted outwards with more force at its mouth. The entrance, a titanic release of deadly energy. Huge pieces of masonry. Metal flew like missiles through the dark morning air, hissing with a deadly force. The sonic boom of the explosion deafened the dark morning skies. Clive had a slow-motion image of the chaotic debris decapitating some waiting passengers on the platform, their bodies smashed into pieces by the force of the explosion. Clive slowed the titanic forces in his mind to a still photograph type image. He made it stop. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound of Newton's cradle returned from his peripheral hearing, as the sound of the explosive forces stopped at the same instant as the horrific images. "She won't come now," said the voice with evil mirth in Clive's head. "She's gone forever." There was a sense of finality in the last words. "They will be ready for you shortly, Mr. Caldwell," the nurse said chirpily. Clive was handcuffed to the wheelchair. Two burly attendants on each side of the wheels. The door opened suddenly, and Clive was wheeled into the meeting room. There was a committee of 3 men and 2 ladies waiting inside, all seated behind desks, files, and papers, laptops in front of them, and on the side, seated ready to take minutes, a transcriber of the meeting, was a young administration lady wearing a bright puce lady's suit. Sitting separately in the corner of the room was a strange man with dark glasses. The attendants and the chirpy nurse stood at the side and behind Clive, seated in the wheelchair. "How are you today, Mr. Caldwell?" said one of the women, a member of the committee. Before Clive could answer, the women started the introduction to the meeting. The psychiatric team of Edmundston Mental Hospital. In attendance today, Dr. Schwartz, Dr. Sari, Dr. Braun, Dr. Zellini, and myself, the chairperson, Dr. Malva, presiding over case 10476, Mr. Clive Caldwell. Dr. Malva paused. "Now, Mr. Caldwell, under the Mental Health Act of 2018, we are required to conduct a regular status review of your condition. The committee has your records, and we have duly reviewed all the details, including your recent status of the last 6 months, and we find some improvements in your condition. We have some questions for you today. Do you feel in a frame of mind to answer?" Clive paused for some moments before he answered calmly. "Yes, that's okay." "Okay. Looking at the records, we find that your medication is stabilizing your previous traumas. There are no reported incidents of violent behavior. Do you have visions? Or when was the last time you had any distressing visions, Mr. Caldwell?" "I can't remember. Not for some time," Clive quietly replied. "Good. And what about voices? Do you hear any voices in your head nowadays?" "No, ma'am. And I don't have any headaches either," Clive added. "Very good. We, the committee, believe that you no longer pose a security risk, not whilst you are in this institution, and you are taking your prescribed daily medication. We have also agreed that based on a clean incident-free record under the constant observation of this institution, that in 6 months we can look at a release program. What do you say about that, Mr. Caldwell?" "Great. Getting me time back again. Thank you, ma'am," Clive said with some hesitation. He looked to the corner of the room at the seated stranger. The seated stranger took off his dark glasses and peered directly at Clive. He had no eyes. Instead, where there should be eyes and eye sockets, there were 2 black holes. They looked like tunnel entrances, with the scars and scorch marks of fire caused by tremendous explosive blast were evident on and around the circumference of the black holes. The stranger's expression didn't change. His face was peering directly at Clive, and then he smirked and mouthed silently, "What time will she come? Who is that?" Clive thought. "The past and the future, you arsehole. Don't look at him, you idiot," said the voice in Clive's head. "Okay, nurse, take Mr. Caldwell away, and we will see the next patient." The attendants reversed the wheelchair out of the meeting room. Clive's first thought, 5 minutes and 12 seconds. Meetings are getting shorter. Clive was grinning, a crooked smile which never disappeared off his face, but no one noticed his eyes. peering at nothing. There seemed to be something going on behind the masked appearance on his face, his pasted-on smile, his eyes. It was a charade for the continued monitoring and inspection of all at Edmundston. He wore the mask like a reveler at Mardi Gras, his unique disguise. Fake it to make it, the voice in Clive's head. Told you we'd be out of here. Just keep smiling, Sonny. Just be patient with these arseholes for a little while longer. Who's always looked after you, Sonny Jim. Always. Right from the beginning of time. Click. Clack. The sound of the orbs in Newton's cradle continued counting time. Clive's time. The Roomba Facebook Marketplace. Roomba 600E. Details. Condition. Used like new. Description. Slightly used. Comes with all accessories and 2 chargers. Price. Negotiable. Need gone. ASAP. Christine kicked off her heels as soon as she walked through the door. The French baguette, peeking out of the brown paper bag in her hands, wobbled precariously as Sir Lancelot wove his way beneath her feet, while she attempted to place the groceries on the bench. Lancelot was a Persian crossed with a rag doll, and the combination equated to hair. Lots of it. Christine scanned her critical eye over the apartment. Clumps of fur wafted everywhere. She loved little Lancy immensely, but she didn't love his hair. She sighed as she opened the hall cupboard to get out her cumbersome Hoover, a relic that had belonged to her mother and had been passed down to her. It was time for its second workout of the day, and she just hoped the ancient beast was up for the task. The high-pitched groan was ominous, as was the smell of electrical burning that began moments after she had switched the machine on. Christine immediately disconnected the power and resigned herself to her fate. It was time to purchase a new vacuum. Unfortunately, her finances were still limited, and so she opened her phone to browse Facebook Marketplace. Surely she would find a deal there. It wasn't as if she was fussy. Anything that would work would be better than trying to sweep up the unsweepable. The price caught her eye first. Then the picture. A Roomba. A robot vacuum. Imagine coming home each day to a house that was freshly cleaned. No cat hair, no dust. The more she thought about it, the more Christine became convinced that she could not possibly live one more day without the services of her own personal Roomba robot. A quick series of messages back and forth, and soon Christine found herself the proud new owner of a second-hand robot vacuum. Be careful with the settings. It's a bit of a beast if you're not keeping an eye on it, the previous owner had advised her. She'd smiled and nodded, figuring that the internet would have all the instruction manuals and safety precautions listed somewhere. Once she plugged in the charging dock, Christine Googled the instructions and set the operating time to run twice a day while she was at work. With a happy sigh, she fed Lancey his dinner, reheated leftovers for herself, and went to bed. She was jolted awake at 4 in the morning by a soft mechanical whirring and solid, repeated thumps that shook her bed. Lancey, startled awake from his sleeping position at the foot of her bed, hissed violently as he landed on her chest, claws extended. It took her a bleary moment to connect the dots, but she finally realized she'd set the timer incorrectly, setting the machine to work at 4 a.m. instead of 4 p.m. It seemed to be stuck, trying to vacuum under her bed, catching itself repeatedly on the leg, and unable to navigate its way out of the situation. The bright lights, like little eyes, glinted with frustration, which echoed her own emotional state. It really was way too early for her to remember the settings, so she stumbled out of bed as she tried to whack the off button on the machine. It finally powered down with a petulant wheeze, the lights blinking off sadly. Placating Lancey took much longer, as his fur was literally on end. But after much stroking and coaxing, the cat settled back at the foot of the bed, curled up in a cat ball, and purred himself to sleep. The following morning, after feeding Lancey his breakfast, Christine studied the online manual closely as she absently munched on toast and sipped her coffee. Carefully following the instructions, she set the timer, double-checking the AM/PM setting. From his sunny position on the windowsill, Lancey hissed and arched his back. A familiar whirring caught her attention, and a soft bumping nudged her toes. When she looked beneath the table, the Roomba was carefully vacuuming the crumbs she had spilled. "Odd," she muttered. "I haven't turned you on yet. Must be a saved setting from the previous owner." She didn't have time to look for the clear all settings section of the manual, but resolved to look into it after work. Once again, Christine was rudely awoken at 4 a.m. by the repeated thumping of the machine and the yowling hiss of the cat as Lancey landed claws first on her chest. "For the love of," she muttered, tossing her blanket aside to deal with the rogue machine. This time, the off button seemed to stick, and she was unable to power it down. "Well, if you won't switch off, you may as well do your job out here." Christine shoved the machine into the living room and firmly closed her bedroom door. Lancey would be all right for a couple of hours. She'd let him out for a kitty litter break as soon as the sun was up. The morning brought chaos. Christine's living room was spotlessly clean, immaculate even, but she couldn't find her shoes. She usually kicked them off by the front door, but they were nowhere to be seen. She rummaged under the sofa and coffee tables, just in case she had kicked them off in the living room, and then crawled into the dust bunnies under her bed, on the off chance they were there, but to no avail. Finally, she had to do a quick change of outfit so that she could wear the more casual loafers in the back of her wardrobe, and rushed out of the door, late for work. When she came home, Christine kicked off her shoes near the door as she juggled the bags of groceries she'd purchased after work. The light on the Roomba's dock was flashing, indicating that the dustbin needed emptying, so she dumped the heavier bags on the floor to attend to the task. When she lifted the lid, a mystery was solved. There, in shreds, were her lovely leather, high-heeled shoes. They'd obviously been caught by the Roomba overnight and had become a casualty of the cleaning machine. At least there's a reasonable explanation, she sighed as she took the small dustbin to empty into the outside bin, happy that she wasn't losing her mind, but not happy about the cost of replacing her favorite shoes. When she returned, she cried out in alarm. The Roomba was stuck on the paper shopping bag, and its whirring brushes had opened a hole in the washing powder box. Fine white ponder was flying everywhere. "Oh, for the love of..." she cried in exasperation as she extracted the paper bag from the maw of the machine. She set it to clean up the white laundry powder while she packed the rest of the groceries away. When she turned from the pantry, after putting the last item on the shelf, she nearly tripped over the Roomba that had silently moved its cleaning path right behind her, its lights blinking up at her like two besotted eyes. With a gasp, she stopped herself from falling just in time by grabbing the fridge door with one hand and banging her other forearm hard on the kitchen bench. She cried out in pain, and she wrenched the freezer open to get an ice pack. Pressing the ice to her smarting injury, she trudged into the living room to rest and assess the damage. Hopefully, she hadn't broken anything. The skin was still intact, but she'd have a huge bruise tomorrow. No doubt. Lancey curled up next to her and purred as she scratched his head with one hand. She'd just relaxed enough for the shock and pain to wear off when the cat hissed and leapt from the couch. A soft whirring approached, and the Roomba trundled in, bumping gently into Christine's feet. "Goodness, you're more trouble than you're worth," she told the machine as she stood up to make herself some dinner and pour Lancey some kitty kibble into his food bowl. Christine shut her bedroom door that evening, determined to get a full night's sleep and not be woken by a marauding machine at an ungodly hour. She had to lock Lancey out, much to his disgust, as she didn't want him to lose access to his litter tray and have an accident in her bedroom. Her sleep was undisturbed, and she woke refreshed and ready to begin the day. In the kitchen, she noticed that Lancey had not finished his dinner last night. The bowl was still full of kibble. "Lancey? Here, kitty, kitty," she called as she opened a can of cat food. He was not around, sulking, most likely because she didn't let him sleep on her bed. "I'll leave it here for you then." She emptied the old kibble and replaced it with some tuna. As Christine ate her toast, she felt the whirring of little brushes bumping into her toes. So she lifted her feet to allow the Roomba to pass under the table on its morning cleanup rotation. She'd long since given up the idea of setting the machine to work when she was not home. It seemed to have a mind of its own and cleaned at all sorts of random times during the day. She didn't think much of the little trail of red on her foot when she put her loafers on, just brushed the smudge away. "Bye, Lancy," she called as she left for work. The cat was still sulking. Perhaps he'd be more cuddly when she got home. When she returned, her apartment smelt like rotting fish, and she gagged as she opened the door. The cat food was still sitting in the bowl uneaten, and flies were buzzing around the dish, along with a trail of ants. Quickly, Christine disposed of the food. "Lancy," she crooned gently, and then again, more urgently. Perhaps the cat was unwell. The Roomba's light indicated a full dust bin, and Christine noticed the trail of ants marching up the side. She opened the lid and screamed. Blood and fur and pulverized viscera filled the bin. She ran to the bathroom and heaved, retching up the contents of her stomach as tears ran down her face. From behind her, there was a whirring sound, and the Roomba looked at her with its bright lights unblinking. Facebook Marketplace. Roomba 600E. Details. Condition. Used like new. Description. Slightly used. Comes with all accessories and 2 chargers. Price negotiable. Need gone ASAP. Just deserts. It is impossible to resist a hitchhiker on a road to nowhere. And that was exactly what my cousin Shane's wedding to Raven the following morning was going to be. It was strange that we all gathered to wish them well, when none of us would be there in 2 years, when the ineluctable breach of the sacrament was ratified by the divorce judge. After Shane's degenerate, pathological gambling resulted in the foreclosure of Raven's overpriced bungalow-style home in Boulder City, which she would naively agree to mortgage to the hilt to bail him out, setting up the bad beat betrayal she'd been waiting for from the day they met. That is the thing about El Sombreron. He ties his 4 mules to his inamoratos post, while he woos from the threshold with sweet songs strummed on a silver guitar, plucking notes of promise, woven in plaited spirals like Guatemalan braids. But once the affair begins, he leaves the stomach empty. Madre de Dios. At length, his black dogs howl their dismal mourning at the snow moon, which searches in vain, like a celestial spotlight, for what is left of the shriveled Chiquispeo. Still, it is said that the old man never forgets the ones he has loved. I must apologize. My mind is prone to wandering. It is part of my condition. I wonder how often Pablo Tak felt the same way, baptizing savages in the frontier who were more than likely bent for a hell of their own making. How many does El Sombreron visit to pay them their wages? Sabrina, the Jamaican flight attendant, with the perfectly symmetrical face and the caramel complexion scolded Carl, who sat right next to me, saying, "Stay seated while the seat belt sign is illuminated. Don't make me tell you again." The seat belt light had been illuminated since the plane touched off, and tropical storm Tomas caught us in its clutches, sending us in an interminable loop between Tortilla Flats and Scottsdale. Carl muttered something under his whiskey-smelling breath. Sitting down, Carl released a low, rumbling cough that rattled in his chest like a cracked carburetor. We were off to a famous start. I didn't know how long I'd had a demon, but El Sombreron was in the back row with his broad-brimmed, high-crowned black hat angled down while he napped. I was safe for now. I could hear him whispering, "Stefan, you can't hide in your books forever. Sooner or later, you will have to face me. Face your undoing. You will have to face what you have done." While I wondered when El Sombreron would make his move, I stroked my necklace with the coat of arms pendant, striped blue and red, with an eagle at the crest. I kept reading from Alta, California, a book of essays about Spanish and Mexican settlers in the Spanish borderlands. I was reading about the life of Pablo Tac, a Luiseno Indian who, despite dying at age 19, was a prolific writer and missionary whose extensive writings were the only surviving accounts of the Luiseno language and culture, and one of the most studied reports of missionary life on the frontier. I had a second book in my bag, Memories of Life at a Mission, a biographical account written by Pablo Tac himself. Carl had to get up so he could get something out of his bag in the overheads. When he sat back down, he had a stack of medical reports in hand. The header of his papers read, "Dr. Carl Kellogg, MD, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center," and I spotted a reference to someone named Sal. Carl said, "I have an appointment to keep. I'll be damned if I am going to miss it. The next thing they're going to tell us is the flight is diverted to goddamn Phoenix." On cue, the pilot came back over the PA to inform us that the flight was, indeed, being grounded in Phoenix for the night, and that the airline would arrange for replacement transportation, but given the lateness of the hour, it would have to be the following day. Those that did not wish to sleep in the airport would have a room comped nearby. I was relieved when they first told me about the glioblastoma. I'd gone directly to St. Peter's Episcopal Church and entered the confessional, and I'd told Father Darby how I'd been driving home from the history conference in Ithaca a few years back, after too many celebratory toasts, and quite a few tequila shooters from the mini bar to boot. I'd only wanted to sleep in my bed that night. I'd told Father Darby how I'd heard a thud and a crack of my windshield. The blue-jeaned body of a teenage girl hung in the rear view, perfectly cradled in the refracted lamplight. How I'd kept on driving. How many Hail Marys to fix that one? Sabrina offered me a beverage, which I sternly declined, and I asked her softly, "Do you see a man about 6 rows back with a black-brimmed hat?" She turned, dutifully, and then looked down at me with wide eyes. No, I do not, sir," she said. "Is everything okay?" I nodded. I was safe for now. As we began our descent into Phoenix, Carl became apoplectic. He stowed his hands in a rigid, set position on his knees and trained his eyes forward at Sabrina like she was his jailer. And he stood wrongly accused. "I have an important appointment in the morning in San Diego. I can't be late. I just can't." Carl said all of this more to himself than anything. Sabrina paid no attention. I put my hand on Carl's shoulder and said, "We will figure this out together. We are going to the same place. So, you are proposing we drive around the storm through the night to San Diego? Are you nuts? You want to make that appointment or not?" I asked. And so, we tossed our luggage in the back of a silver Toyota Tacoma 4-door and hit the road. "I saw your paperwork. So, you are a doctor? A surgeon?" Carl said. "What about you?" "I am a history teacher, college level, up at Cornell. My research relates to sojourners and missionaries, all manner of settlers and vagabonds, anyone uprooted from their home and stranded in a foreign land. Aren't they fascinating, I suppose? That book you were reading, it was about one of those? Pablo-Tack. Who? A young missionary boy who grew up in the Mission San Luis Rey. And what makes him so special? Pablo-Tack? Well, for one, he had a motto: "Siempre adelante y nunca para atrás." It was more than a saying. It became his epitaph. He died young. I don't know it for a certainty, but I imagine Pablo-Tack didn't live long enough to make a mistake he'd regret for the rest of his life. Sounds foolish. He's lucky he made it that long, out on the frontier. Carl's mind seemed trained to detect pathology in everything. You know, Pablo made it to Rome to study for the priesthood, then returned to the frontier. He left behind quite a body of work, made a record of nearly his whole life, day by day. Imagine covering that much ground by age 19. And how did he die, if I might ask? Smallpox. There you go. The boy devotes himself to God, and boom, clapping his hands for effect. He's snuffed out like a match in between God's bloodthirsty fingers. I think it was a gift that God allowed him to finish his mission early. Besides, if Pablo-Tack could get that far by 19, then there's hope for a couple of middle-aged codgers like us, don't you think? I said things like this, hope, as if I still dared to wish for an unearned pardon. I wondered if all sojourners are really on the run, each sure, in their own way, that redemption could only be granted, if at all, a long way off from the place where the crime happened. I guess fugitives are always prisoners of the truth. All I see is a promising man stomped under heel by a dictator. So there's no point to suffering. I'm an oncologist. You cure the sick. Cure? Oh no. I specialize in pancreatic cancer. The 5-year survival rate is 12%. My nickname among my colleagues is the Grim Reaper. So, no, I wouldn't exactly say that I cure the sick. More like I chaperone them to death's doorstep. I'm a butcher with dull blades, just an order taker at a meat counter. My patients' diagnoses are like those number dispenser tags in a supermarket. You know those red machines with the Garvey pull-off tags? I call their numbers and deliver the meat to the morgue. Remind me to never call you for a consult, I said. And we both laughed. What is that pendant you were playing with on the plane? Oh, this. It is the DeSantis family crest. A gift from my father. I was raised out by the Mission San Luis Rey by my foster family. I consider myself a DeSantis, but my birth name is Stefan Daskalov. That is a foreign-sounding name, if I ever heard one. Where are you from, originally? I was born in Bulgaria, in the year of the Jubilee. And what was that like, growing up in Eastern Europe? I wouldn't know. My mother and I left when I was 8. Was there something going on there you had to get away from? You could say that. We were Turks, which is not such a good thing if you were living in Bulgaria. There was a national campaign to rename all Turks and erase our ethnicity. My father was an enthusiast for the resistance, and the communist jackboots came and pulled him from our home and took him to a labor camp on the island of Belen on the Danube. He died there that same year, but we never even learned how. And what happened to your mother? After that, my mother and I emigrated to Turkey to escape persecution. She put me on a boat headed to California, promising she'd follow after. She couldn't ever save up enough for her ticket. And I never saw her again. Some years ago, I traveled back to Turkey and found the town where she was buried. It is strange. It seems like another world, one that I barely knew. That reminded me that I had another thing to say Hail Marys for. Jesus, that is one hell of a way to start out in life. You know, there was nothing written on her tombstone. Out behind the old house, a real road to nowhere. Traveling west along I-8, we drank tall coffees and looked out on the vast desert, like two teens taking a road trip, rather than two terminally ill hypocrites. The massive orange dunes propagated to infinity, hugging dappled purple shadows for warmth, their peaks glistening in the penetrating spears of mulish moonlight smuggled past the veil. Great towering thunderheads bellowed and filled the sky like totipotent corpuscles injected with black-gray swirls of ink and mercury. Stefan took a wrong turn before Yuma. We finally stopped at a rickety bridge, the McFall Bridge. The bridge cut a path over the Gila River toward the coastal mountains. The GPS glitched and told us to cross, but the sign read, "Bridge closed." Graffiti on the guardrails read, "Bridge to nowhere. We'll have to backtrack and find another way through," I said. "I guess we've come to the end of the road," Carl said, belting out an uncharacteristic laugh, then resuming his rumbling coughs, the gasps and chokes of a stalling engine. "For your sake? I hope not." "Look up there," I said, pointing at two figures walking across the McFall Bridge toward us, carrying canvas sacks. They emerged from the hazy expanse, blown in with the petrichor which flavored the charged and static air. The purple thunderheads pulsed with bursts of voltage, branching like the paradoxical imics of reaching tree limbs and searing flares. The bushes and cactuses accented the barren landscape with the resilient wit of life persisting on vapors, ruffled in a fanning and pitiless wind, trending to death. There was a sudden knock. They were two young boys. I rolled down my window. "I'm Bobo, and this is my friend Amix. We are headed to California. It's been a long journey, and the storm is coming in fast." "Oh, shame," said Carl. "Do you think we could tag along until you get to Yuma? We can help you navigate in the desert. We know the way." I looked over at Carl, who nodded his approval. "Jump in," I said. "The safest way is to backtrack to I-8 and take that all the way down. We are in a hurry." "Is there a faster route?" Carl asked. "Well, you could take the Camino del Diablo, but I wouldn't recommend it." "What is that in English?" "The Devil's Highway." Bobo nodded. Carl let out another hearty laugh. He turned to me and said, "How could we refuse?" And that was when I knew that Carl wasn't long for this world, and guessed that his appointment was not for a special case, but for palliative care. Over my shoulder, I saw that El Sombreron was sitting between the boys. His head hung expectantly over his silver guitar. Death was alive in the cadaverous pallor of Carl's complexion. The color ran out of him like a rich, milky cheddar cheese that starts a bright orange but whitens and hardens so quickly when left out on the cutting board. Carl had already begun to decompose. I wondered if Carl had cats. If you die alone, a dog won't eat you. A hungry cat is another thing altogether. Bobo was a skeletal man, not more than 5'3". His khaki Anouks shirt hugged his body, making him appear in the dark like a human shadow. "I see you are reading Pablo Tak, Memories of Life at a Mission." "Yes, I am," I said, surprised. "Have you read it?" "Ah, yes. What a heartbreaker. Wait until you get to the last chapter where he is called back to Rome for ordination." Bobo tossed his sack over his shoulder and began walking back down the Devil's Highway. "I thought he died awaiting ordination," I called after, but Bobo was already gone. I had one of the last collector editions sold at auction at San Luis Rey. The thing is, as I watched Bobo and Amix disappear into the dust of the desert, it occurred to me that this book had been out of print for decades, since before these boys were born. Now, it was just Carl, me, and El Sombreron on the Camino del Diablo, in the dead of night, on our way to separate destinations, but sharing one fate. After driving for hours in what must have been circles, the warning light for refilling the gas tank came on, squeaking over and over at regular intervals, like a diseased heart incapable of variation. And we only had one reserve gas can left in the trunk. "Carl," I said, "let's camp out here for the night and save our last fuel can for the daylight. I don't want to get lost." Carl was looking ghastly and pallid. "I have s'mores ingredients. I was saving them for the night after the wedding. But I say we build a proper fire and enjoy them tonight." We gathered sticks, and I used leader fluid, charcoal, and pieces of paper to help get the fire going. Even with all of that, I was barely successful out there in the dark. How did men build fires like these for thousands of years in the hard-hearted blackness? I pulled the sleeping bags out of the trunk, grabbed little baggies with graham crackers, marshmallows, and chocolate squares. Carl livened up, and the two of us chatted late into the night before falling asleep in our sleeping bags. At the edge of the fire, fingers sticky and bellies full. The night grew cold. Before the first rays of efflorescent dawn emerged from the undercroft of Gehenna, I arose, a diaphanous shroud. Carl rose with me. We both looked at the smoldering fire, the fulgent, crackling embers, the hoary, thinning smoke. Two bodies in sleeping bags, cold and stiff in the first light, looking at one another. Then at the horizon, I noticed that the cool desert morning felt warm and radiant on my skin. It shimmered as it touched my arms, like the glint of light off a lizard's scales. "Are we almost to the mission?" I asked Carl. Carl barely had time to shrug his shoulders before we were interrupted. El Sombreron strutted in a waddling gait down the road ahead, leading his train of mules into our camp. His spurs jingled, and each rock gave its distinct harmony to the singing rowels. The mules whuffled and snorted the bass line, and El Sombreron whistled while chewing on a stick of straw plucked from the breaching rays of the new sun. The brim of his broad-rimmed black sombrero forever hid his visage. And he came to a stop just before us. "Do you see him?" I asked. Carl nodded, but when his strength failed him at length, El Sombreron said, and I instinctively continued. He met a pilgrim shadow. With that, El Sombreron gave a little bow and continued. Over his heart, a shadow fell. "But which way is the mission?" I asked. "Ride, boldly ride," the shade replied. "To where?" "Over the mountains of the moon, down the valley of the shadow." Not the brightest bulb. The light panned over the coast, gutting the night like a blade through a fish's belly. Emerson, League Saw. From experience, he knew the storm would be raging well into the next day. But he'd be safe here. This lighthouse had weathered many storms before this one, and it would weather many more after, too. It had stood here since before he was born, and it would stand long after he was dead. Which wouldn't be long now, he reasoned. He raised his metal cup to the windows, which looked out onto the frothing midnight ocean. He offered the night his cheers, then sipped his neat rum. Lightning lit up the abyss, burning his retinas white for one faltering heartbeat. The wind whipped and whooped around the edges of the lighthouse. The rumble of thunder came 3 seconds later, reverberating through his bones. Emerson blinked. The ocean was a cruel mistress sometimes. He knew that more than anybody. He'd spent much of his life aboard fishing vessels, at sea for months. He felt more at home on the open sea than on dry land. That was why he'd taken on the task of lighthouse keeper after retirement. But it seemed that people had lost their respect for the water. Kids rode inflatable beds out on riptides and needed rescuing. Rich yuppies took their boats out in unsafe conditions and needed rescuing. Partying youngsters went for midnight swims whilst inebriated. They drew the attention of the sea beasts, which they then hunted for revenge. And thus, the creatures needed rescuing due to their dwindling numbers. Companies dumped their foul excretions into the blue, so the sea needed rescuing too. Emerson growled and scowled out. The thunder and lightning lashed from the heavens once again. The rain pelted sideways at the window, rattling against the glass. The gale screamed like a dying creature, wounded by a harpoon. Another sound chimed throughout the lighthouse, but this had nothing to do with thunder. He grunted. Somebody had rung the lighthouse's doorbell. Who on earth could that be? The lighthouse clung to a rocky piece of coast that jutted out into the ocean. It was far from any town or village, as Emerson liked it. The only company he usually had came in the form of passing boats and hungry seagulls. Emerson took another swig of rum and set his cup on the table. The wood bore the marks of 1,000,000 condensation rings from the rum mugs of history. He grumbled to himself and passed through the door to the spiral staircase. The doorbell rang again as he descended. With care, the final treacherous steps. He threw the door open to the howling wind. "Yar, I'm coming, I'm coming. Hold your seahorses." On the stoop, 2 kids huddled together, no older than 18. They clung to one another as the wind whipped at them, and the storm soaked them to their bones. "I'm sorry, sir," said the boy, raising his voice over the gale. "But our car broke down, and we're stranded. Can we please hold up with you until the storm has passed?" Emerson was not a people person, but he was also not a heartless monster either. He opened the door to the boy and the girl and guided them up the staircases. "Yar, come in, come in. You're wetter than water. I got some blankies upstairs. Come, let's get you and your lass dry. Me name's Emerson." The boy smiled and offered his hand despite the chill that shook him. "Thanks, man. You're the best, Harry. And this is Skyla." Emerson led them up the winding staircase to the lighthouse's upper room, lit by the beacon. He got some dry towels, stale and mud-eaten, but dry, and put the kettle on for warm tea. You must be pretty frightened. What with you stranded in the dark and the rain, while the sea beats her chest like King Kong. She can be mighty fierce." The boy pulled a face and shook his head. He wrapped a towel around Skyla's shoulders before he tended to himself. "No, inconvenienced and uncomfortable, but not scared." Emerson frowned, but bit his tongue. He guided the youngsters to his couch. It wouldn't be the first time it got wet, and handed them mugs of steeping tea. He sighed and sat down opposite them on his old rickety chair. "And what, if you don't mind me asking, were you two doing out here this late at night?" The boy and the girl blushed. Harry started to say something, but then Skyla interrupted. She shoved her left hand into Emerson's face. A diamond glinted on her ring finger. "Harry proposed to me tonight," as the sun set over the water, staining it red, the color of love. Isn't that romantic? To Emerson, red was the color of blood, once you'd chummed the waters to lure in the big fish. But he didn't say this. "Yar, it do warm this old sea dog's heart to see young love in bloom. Why, my Batilda and I, we shared quite a torrid love affair, we did. But she's been sleeping with the fishes for longer'n you been alive. I still carry her picture in this old locket here, which I wear around me neck at all times. Here, take a look at this beauty, lad, but don't lose your eye for the young lass now, aye." The boy blinked at the picture in the sea air-rusted locket. He did a double take. He seemed to struggle for words. His eyebrows knotted together like a bowline. "Sir, that's a manatee," Emerson recoiled. "You youngsters and your unrealistic Hollywood beauty standards. You shouldn't perpetuate such unhealthy attitudes towards appearances. It only fosters anxiety and insecurity. Yar, you might be young and lovely now, but see how pretty you'll look in 60 years. Let's see how you are once the sea's done rusted your lungs and your legs been took by an orca and a great white workin' in cahoots." The girl reached over and rapped a knuckle on his shin. A smirk touched the corners of her lips. "But sir, both your legs are still attached," Emerson yelped and tucked his legs back under his chair. "I jumped into the blood-stained brine, I did. Wrestled me legs back from the bellies of the respective beasts at the same time. fought them both off, using nothing but me bare hands. I sewed them back on, I did, using nothing but a bit of old gut fishing line. I cleaned the wounds by spitting on 'em, then patched meself back up. It hurt for a while, but it didn't affect me well-trained balance on the deck. Yar, at sea you needs good sea legs, especially whilst Poseidon's throwin' you about like a dusty old rug that your mama's trying to clean. The kids exchanged a glance and snickered. That didn't happen, did it, sir? Asked the boy. You're having us on. Emerson bit his lip. He knew how to get through to these young'uns, to teach them the proper respect they ought to have for the ocean. Emerson had seen waves taller than buildings and fish bigger than elephants. He'd seen currents sweep sailors to their doom in seconds. Emerson had seen men sink into the abyss as waves pummeled them like a boxer in a match with no referee to ring the bell. These kids had been on dry land, but the ocean was hungry. She could reach out and snatch you from the shore if she wanted. They had gotten lucky. The midnight tide hadn't pulled them out to sea, whilst the boy popped the question. Emerson got to his feet and slipped out the door to the spiral staircase. I have something to show yer. You wait right here, my lovelies. Confused whispers came from behind him. Outside, the storm continued to rage. The wind screamed and the rain lashed. The ocean roared and threw itself against the lighthouse's base. The foundations shuddered. Emerson found the switch, covered in warning stickers, and flicked it. The lighthouse went dark. A small shriek came from above. He ascended in shadow, grinning at the panicked voices. He barged through the door and clicked the torch on. He illuminated his haggard face from below and bellowed. It was a dark and stormy night. Harry and Skyla screamed and clung to each other, their faces pulled in a rictus of terror in the torch's beam. What the hell? Began the boy, but Emerson cut him off. The ocean was raging. The night was black. You couldn't tell where the sky ended and the water began. And we all knew that she, the creature, was out there hunting us. The hunters had become the hunted. A foghorn shattered the tension, deafening them all. Harry jumped up, knocking his chair over backwards. Skyla shrieked and threw her hands up to her face. A flick of a fish's tail later, the lighthouse shook around them. A great, wrenching metallic crunch rocked the world. Ice froze his limbs. He broke through the paralysis and staggered to the window. He shined his flashlight onto the rocks below. Good God, whispered Emerson. The jagged stones had acted like a shark's teeth, puncturing the ship's hull. It leaned like a drunken sailor, 45 degrees to the side. On top, seamen clung to the rails, whilst others tried to scramble about the rain-wet deck. Baffled shouts punctured the storm's wailing. Boxes of cargo crashed into the surf. Some sailors tossed life rings into the brine to rescue men overboard. Emerson whimpered. This lighthouse had not had a single accident for almost 100 years. And now, in one swift hour, he'd caused a disaster. He should never have exaggerated the truth to impress these kids. The ocean was scary and beautiful enough as it was. It didn't need cheapening with manufactured myths and legends, but he'd tried to scare them into respecting the fierce hand of nature. Tried and failed. They thought he was an old coot who'd messed up on the job, and they wouldn't exactly be wrong now, would they? He'd forgotten the very lesson he'd been trying to teach. His shoulders slumped. Yar, I'm not the brightest bulb, methinks.